You can't test that. This video is about some things that people say you can't test. Well, we have big news this week. It's the Paxlovid primary prophylaxis study. They take people who are exposed to someone in their household with COVID-19, they randomize them to Paxlovid or no Paxlovid, and they ask, does Paxlovid, the drug everyone's a buzz about, prevent you from getting COVID-19? And the verdict is in. It doesn't work at all. It doesn't prevent you from getting COVID-19. Pfizer announced that. Their shares took a bit of a dip. This is the drug that the Biden administration has thrown a lot of money in. Of course, it does has randomized trial data showing that it works. The EPIC-HR study, that's a study of unvaccinated people with a higher risk factor for bad outcomes with COVID-19, and they were randomized within 5 days of symptoms to Paxlovid or not, and it has a 89% relative risk reduction. That's the relative risk. The absolute risk is if you're in that group and you didn't take Paxlovid, you have about a 7% chance of hospitalization or death. And if you did take Paxlovid, it drops to 1%. That's EPIC-HR. We also know about Paxlovid that it failed in the primary prophylaxis study, that it doesn't prevent you from getting SARS-CoV-2 if you encounter somebody who has it. So it's a very interesting drug. Now, Todd Lee and I wrote an article for City Journal. I'm going to put a link below, and we talk about how for the biggest population of people, which is people who've either had and recovered from COVID-19 or they've been vaccinated, and by the way, that's the vast, vast majority of Americans, do we have data on whether Paxlovid works? Like, we know it works in people who are unvaccinated and have a high-risk feature. Sure, absolutely it works in that group. That's the EPIC-HR cohort. We know it doesn't work for this sort of down the road indication, this sort of primary prophylaxis indication. But what about the bulk of the use? The person who's vaccinated, the person who may have had COVID, the person who may not quite have the risk factors for bad outcomes. Does it work there? Well, there was a randomized control trial that for some time enrolled patients like that, the EPIC-SR study, and they put out a press release, but they haven't published the results, so we really don't know. And in the press release, they said that 89%, it wasn't 89%, it was 70%, and the raw numbers were like 2% and change to 0.7%, but it included some unvaccinated people in EPIC-SR. And then they made a protocol amendment saying that they're only going to look at unvaccinated people. But that's a big problem, because what we need right now is evidence that Paxlovid works in vaccinated people or people who've gotten one booster or two boosters, like the vice president. It was announced that Kamala Harris is taking Paxlovid, but does it work in someone like her? I don't know about all her potential risk factors, but I do know it's been well documented that she's had the primary vaccination series and a booster or two. So does it work in that population? We have to compel Pfizer to show us that data. Run a randomized trial on people vaccinated, people post one booster. Show me that it works before we take the public purse and open it up to Albert Bourla to take billions of dollars out of that public purse. And that's the theme of our article in City Journal. And the other thing we say is that, look, this medicine costs $500 a round, a pop. And that doesn't sound like a lot when you're treating unvaccinated high-risk people, and it isn't a lot in that group. But as you treat people at lower and lower and lower risk, that number of people you have to treat to avert a bad outcome, it's got to go up and up and up and up. And that's best case scenario. That's best case scenario. So what's the return on investment? What's the dollar per quality of adjusted life here of this product? What's the cost effectiveness of it? Are we spending, I don't know, $100,000 to do this? Are we spending $1 million, $10 million? I don't know. We need to see data to make that calculation. And it really does matter, because if you start spending 10 million or 100 million to prevent a hospitalization, there's a lot better things you can do with that money to prevent many, many more hospitalizations. You can improve human health in a lot better ways with that money. It would be cost ineffective if that was a number. So we really need to know, and to know you need data so we can do this study. It's not so hard. Pfizer has a lot of cash. It turns out they got 100 billion reasons they can run this trial this year, because that's how much cash we're giving them. They need to be compelled to do it. And that moves me to the second issue that people say, well, you can't do a trial of that. And that's the public intermittent cloth mask mandate. Let me be very clear. The mandate on the BART here in San Francisco that they just reinstated, the mandate on the airplane, it wasn't a surgical mask mandate. No siree. Because a surgical mask mandate means you had to wear at least a surgical mask or you wouldn't be allowed on that flight. It wasn't that, no. And it wasn't an N95 mask mandate. No, it wasn't that either. It was a cloth mask mandate, because that was the minimum requirement that would satisfy that checks that box. That's all you had to do. And it wasn't a all the time mandate. Let's also remember it was an intermittent mandate, because if you opened that bag of pretzels, you could hang it over one ear and you could eat those pretzels for 45, 50 minutes. If you're in first class, you got a long 3-course meal, you could be taking that mask off or putting it under your chin for a prolonged period of time. And the other thing is, a lot of people have over the years had attrition, and they're using it less effectively than they did when it started. So it's really an intermittent cloth mask mandate. People felt very strongly at the moment we dropped that off in the airplane that even if I'm wearing an N95, or even if the person who's worried is wearing an N95, that the virus is still more likely to spread to them than if we had that intermittent cloth mask mandate. I find it implausible. But I said, look, if you really want to know this, and here in San Francisco, we've reinstated the intermittent cloth mask mandate on the BART, and if you really wanted to know if it was effective, you could do a trial, a cluster randomized trial, where you randomize cars or trains or planes and flights, and to the policy on the flight or not having the policy on the flight. That's the cluster of randomization, the container in which people are transported in. That's the cluster. And then you follow them. You follow them 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later. Maybe you even actively surveil them if you want, or you could just passively just follow them to see if they get COVID-19, and you'll see whether or not this policy actually works or not. And it would be a very clean and elegant trial. And actually, we really ought to do that study. Well, then somebody sent me a blog post written by an epidemiologist that said that this trial wouldn't be feasible. Well, that person just simply doesn't know enough about randomized controlled trials. It's perfectly feasible. Somebody sent me something where they argue it wouldn't be ethical. Well, that assuming you know the answer to the question because you are so confident it works, but I would be doubting the ethics of the trial because I'm so confident it probably doesn't work. I mean, I think if you really wanted to test it, you should test something more plausible than an intermittent cloth mask mandate. You might want to test something that you think might putatively work, like a surgical mask mandate or something more strong. I don't know. I mean, I think I would be in the other direction. But the fact that some individuals feel differently about it, that's okay, because the ethics of a trial, at least one conception of it, is that we have field-wide equipoise. That doesn't mean that every individual should feel perfectly agnostic about it. It just means that as a community, we admit that there is agnosticism. We just don't know the answer. And that's called field-wide equipoise. As a community, we just don't know. And that is certainly met in this case. It is absolutely met. There are plenty of people who are skeptical of it, doctors, physicians, and there are plenty of people who are rah-rah-rah supporters. But across the board, we just don't know. And I think you can safely make that claim. The other thing I think these people don't get is that we've been here before. We've been here so many times. We've been here with cluster randomized trials of the rapid response team, of swabbing people for multi-drug resistant bacteria and then putting them on isolation if they test positive versus not doing that. I'm thinking about the randomized trials Merit, Star ICU, Bug with 2 Gs. We've been there. We can do cluster randomized trials. It's not hard. It's not difficult. It's been done before. Yes, simply because someone is an epidemiologist means that they know some things about epidemiology, but they may not have experience in cluster randomized design, and so they may think that these things are infeasible. But that's a foolish thing to think. They're very feasible. They're tractable. They actually have a huge value of information. So this is something called the VOI theory, the value of an information. And the reason it has such a high value of information is this is something that affects so many people, and people are willing to pay a certain amount of money to avoid wearing the mask. I saw Professor Abeluk from Yale said he thinks the figure's around $50 to avoid mask wearing for a day, but it might even be different. I don't know. I mean, some people may spring for that first class ticket just for a more freedom from masking. But what does that mean? That means that people are willing to pay to not have to do it because they find it inconvenient. And it also means then that providing information about its validity and how well it works would be extremely valuable, because we've already said that this is something that we are placing a value on, that we're willing to quantify the value. So how many bad outcomes are we averting versus how much inconvenience and cost are we bearing? This is the world of economics and medicine. This is the stock and trade of what we do in policy, make these kinds of calculations. It's nothing new. It's nothing special. And if you think it's new and special, you just haven't been around the block enough. You haven't spent enough time in this field. So what do I want to convey in this video? I want to convey the 2 core principles. One, we are paying an inordinate amount of money for Paxlovid. We, ironically, know the least about the most common use, which is the use in somebody who has been vaccinated and having breakthrough, or been vaccinated and boosted and is having breakthrough, or has had COVID, recovered, and having COVID again. That's the most common use, because the majority, we're talking upwards of 70, 80, perhaps even 90% of Americans are in that category of either had it before or been vaccinated or both. And that's the majority of the use of this product. We don't know the number of people you have to treat in that cohort. We don't know. Even if the product is efficacious in that cohort, we don't know. And now we're reading about that post-Paxlovid rebound when you finish your course and then you stop taking it and people suddenly feel worse. That's being increasingly documented. Is that a product of the fact that the trial you're hanging your hat on only included unvaccinated people who may be presenting a little bit sooner, a little bit differently than a vaccinated person is presenting? And so a vaccinated person 5 days after symptoms may be slightly different than an unvaccinated person 5 days after symptoms? I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a very relevant question. The only way to answer it is randomized controlled trials on this question. It's very simple. Very simple. You randomize the people you're actually giving the product to for the product or not having the product, and you see if it actually works. This is medicine 101. You randomize cabins of airplanes to this policy or not having this policy and see if it actually works. It's not rocket science. It's basic evidence-based medicine. The opposition, people opposed to this, or they say it's not possible. I don't know what to think. I mean, one, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt and just assuming that they're ignorant. Their ignorance is carrying the day, and their ignorance is broad. Because throughout medicine, people have often been ignorant about the role and importance of randomized controlled trials. But worse is they're just maybe even true believers. They're not even scientists anymore. They're just kind of tribal true believers. They don't even want to adjudicate uncertainty. And I think it might be a poisonous mix of both. And then the third reason, of course, is it's part of their identity. We've linked this to political party. And ironically, when science fails to generate evidence, of course, politics will move in. It just moves in, and we have two very strong political anchors on this policy. But it didn't have to be that way. We could have run the trials to adjudicate the uncertainty. And so I think it's just a fiasco. It's a total failure. I want to look into the camera and talk to the person who may watch this video 500 years from now. 500 years from now, I want you to know that, we are pretty ignorant and stupid. We could have done this study. We could have answered the question. We didn't do it. And we didn't do it. I don't know why we didn't. We had all the resources and tools, and there were plenty of people calling for it. John Ioannidis called for it. Margaret McCarthy called for doing these simple, pragmatic, randomized trials. Alistair Monroe has written some lovely threads about this. Many people, many thoughtful people called for it, but the powers that be, the forces of the world, would not conduct those studies. And so we failed, and we prove ourselves to be as ignorant and primitive as the people who came before us and faced the many great plagues of Europe, and they didn't generate any evidence either. Maybe we were a little bit better because we could kind of count some things about the virus. Maybe we were a little bit better because we had a slightly better understanding of germ theory, but we weren't a lot better. We didn't use the power of randomization. Some of our counting was inaccurate. Our CDC wasn't quite good about counting. We didn't share data. And so we're pretty primitive and ignorant too. And so if you're watching 400 years from now, some of us knew this at the time. At least some of us knew it. At least some of us knew that we were inadequate and primitive, and we could have done better. I mean, I'm pretty confident we could have done better. So I hope you're doing better in the future. I hope you're running cluster randomized controlled trials, meticulous counting of cases, putting that data all publicly available, transparent, in real time, not these 1 week delays. I hope that you have finally separated your CDC from a policy arm to a data gathering and publishing arm, and not put it together, which is inherently a conflict of interest. I hope that you have firewalls between your politicians and the people who work at FDA, and people aren't pressured to resign over White House pressure on boosters, etc. I hope you're doing better in the future, and just want to let you know that, some of us did understand it at the time. So, all right. If you like this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a message below. Until next time.